Hello there, my name's Alan Stanley. I'm the Knowledge Manager in the Knowledge Impact and Policy Cluster at IDS. I'd like to welcome you to this session, which is on assessing policy engagement capacities. So in this session, we're going to look briefly at capacity as a component of shaping policy with evidence strategies. So thinking about how activities to address capacity needs might fit within an overall approach. We're going to look a little bit at some of the different kinds of capacities that are important for evidence-based practice in different contexts. And then most importantly, we're going to go through a simple framework that you can use to help identify institutional capacity issues and individual learning needs within your particular context. So by the end of the session, you should be able to design that simple capability or capacity assessment framework. You should be able to apply that framework to your particular context, and you should have an idea of where activities to address capacity needs might fit within our overall approach to shaping policy with evidence. Okay, so why are we looking at capacity as an issue? So the table here summarizes the most often experienced barriers to evidence use. It's taken from a large synthesis study of knowledge translation strategies in African health systems, but I think it can be applied. I think the barriers that are identified are fairly universal. So if we're designing a strategy to improve evidence use, what we're essentially doing is designing interventions to address these barriers, or at least that's one way you could think about it. And clearly many of the activities you're likely to come up with would involve either individual capacity building, so to address insufficient skills for knowledge translation up there in the top left, for example, or improving institutional capacity, so improving access to relevant, reliable research at the top in the middle there. So you might want to pause the video here just for a second, have a read through of these different barriers to evidence use, and think about how those might translate into potential areas or activities for building institutional or individual capacity. So hopefully what you've seen there is that there's a mix actually. Some barriers to evidence use can be very directly addressed through capacity type activities. Others you might indirectly benefit from some approaches that involve an element of capacity building, and others, like political factors, for example, or the power dynamics between actors, might not really be easy to address through any kind of capacity intervention. So if we think of about our overall strategy for shaping policy with evidence, if we think about that as being about designing interventions to change the behaviours of key actors in the evidence to policy process, then you can see where capacity has a role to play. It's certainly part of the picture, although equally I think we should recognise it's not the whole picture. Okay, so we've established that capacity is important, but how do we actually go about working out what capacity needs are within a particular situation? So there are numerous capability or capacity assessment tools out there, but a very simple approach that you can take is just to ask your stakeholders what they think are their strengths and weaknesses, and this can be quite an effective strategy. So this is an example here on the right of the slide This is an example of just such an approach. It's an assessment we did for a research organisation as part of a workshop. And the workshop was to design a research uptake strategy for that programme. And in the workshop were a range of academic and communication staff working on that programme. And in this case, we asked them to discuss and then rank different capacity areas and to draw those as a spider diagram, as you can see. And we chose the capacity areas for them to look at based on what we felt were relevant areas to their particular context as a research organisation. So we selected information literacy, for example, so skills in finding and appraising academic literature, the ability to communicate with non-academic audiences, the strength of their networks and partnerships, how good they were at responding to changes in the policy environment, to being responsive and adaptive and agile, the sustainability of their communications and engagement activities, their monitoring and evaluation, and their ability to involve stakeholders at different stages in the research process. So these were all identified based on what we felt were important areas of capacity that they might like to explore. And the workshop gave us a mechanism by which to gather evidence, so to interrogate and understand where they felt they had existing strengths and weaknesses in their capacity. And using this means of presentation as a spider diagram gave us a quick way to present the results in a way that made it possible for us to kind of analyse together and identify areas of action to take forward. Sorry. So the result there is a nice visual representation of their strengths and weaknesses, and the process helped build some consensus around possible activities amongst the participants in the workshop. And I think that's a useful thing to bear in mind as well. It's a useful contribution that this kind of capability assessment exercise can give us. And the results show that, you know, they're strong on information literacy, as you'd expect a research organisation to be. They've got good networks and partnerships, although actually those were mainly with other researchers, so they weren't great at communicating with non-academics. They weren't great at being responsive, as many research organisations aren't. But actually the thing that came out very strongly is their biggest challenge was around funding the time within their programme to spend on research communication and engagement activities. And that was because of the way that their research grant was structured, what they were able to allocate resources towards. So that identified a very clear area of action and something to take forward from the process. So I think the important thing when doing this kind of capability assessment is to identify the right capacity areas. So the categories in this example were for a research organisation. And you'd probably want to ask a slightly different set of questions if you were talking about a policy audience, for example. So just quickly want to highlight a couple of other different frameworks that you might look at in order to identify those relevant capacity areas to explore. So the first of these comes from actually the earlier study that we were looking at, so where we were looking at the table of barriers to evidence use. This list of categories in this example comes from that same paper, that same synthesis of knowledge translation strategies. And again, it's one that works best probably when applied to the supply end of the equation, if you like, the research and evidence production end of the equation. And I'm not going to go through these in detail. Again, you can pause the video if you like and just look at those and get a sense of the questions we were asking. So in this case, this is a survey question actually that was asked as part of a survey of a large group of partners in a big research program. So different research organizations working together as part of a larger research program. Another one that I think it would be useful for you to have a look at has been produced by OECD. They've done some really useful work on breaking down the different areas of capacity that need to be looked at. And it's based on a big review of their work with policymakers in different countries. So it's fairly comprehensive and stands up well, I think. So again, I'm not going to go into these areas in a lot of detail here, but I would recommend that you go away and have a look at this. It's in a fairly well structured document and it's fairly accessible and easy to follow. So the areas covered are, so understanding is about understanding the role of evidence and its place in the policy making cycle. Obtaining is to do with how you gather the existing evidence around a particular policy area, or who you turn to as sources of evidence synthesis, but also how you identify evidence gaps and commission evidence to address those gaps. Interrogating and assessing evidence is about being able to assess the quality of evidence, I guess, in a particular, and how applicable evidence is in a particular context. Using and applying is about understanding where evidence fits and can be used within a particular policy cycle. Engaging with stakeholders is about good communication and collaboration skills. And then evaluating is that M&E, monitoring and evaluation component. Again, how do you build that capacity into the policy cycle to inform and improve the design of your interventions? So I hope you can see that, again, this could be used in a similar way to develop a capacity or capability assessment framework, this time with more of policy orientation. Okay, so that's nearly all for this session. I think the last thing to mention is just that workbook exercise for you to look at before we come together in the webinar. So what I'd like you to do is to adapt this simple framework that we covered earlier. So what you'll need to do is to think about 7 different capacity areas that are appropriate to your particular context, whether that's the organisation where you work, or an organisation you're familiar with, or a programme or a project that you're working on or are familiar with. So these might be the same as the ones that we've identified in the examples that we've given. So you could use the OECD headings to come up with a set of relevant capacity areas, or you could use some of the ones in the 2 other examples that we gave. You could do a combination of those, or you could come up with something different. I think the key thing here is to think about what's appropriate to your particular context. And then you can just complete it yourselves. You don't need to design a particularly robust evidence gathering process. You can just fill it in from your own experience, unless you're really keen and you want to prevail on some of your colleagues to have a go too. And when we come back together in the webinar, then we'll hopefully I'll look forward to seeing a few examples of what you've come up with, and we'll think together about what that might mean for the design of particular activities to address capacity needs. So just finally, these are the references to some of the studies that I've referred to today. They're in the workbook too. If you only have time to look at one, then I'd suggest the OECD report, which, as I've said, gives some very good practical guidance, covers a lot of the same ground to what we've talked about today, and is nicely and accessibly structured, so well worth a look. Okay, that's it for now. Thanks very much.